Tara, will you take the roll, please?
Anthony Moranti.
Here.
Kim Connor. Dennis Gagnon.
Here.
David Hardy.
Here.
Peter Lewis.
Here.
Neil Tolman.
Here.
Neil Zuckerman.
Approval of minutes for June 5th, 2018, regular monthly meeting. Any corrections, deletions, additions? Move to adopt?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Welcome to the June 21st Planning Board meeting at Town of Philipstown. We have two short items, I hope, to take care of before we get into the scoping session. Done Right Construction, 3 Ethan Drive, applicant seeking approval of access to the property with the intent to construct a new single-family residence in the same location as the demolished home. We have a draft resolution prepared. Ron, please.
Yeah. The board's discussed this project before. The subject lot is on a private road, so he's before the board for approval of access on a private road. The direction of the board, referrals were made. That included a referral to the Continental Village Fire Department, and they just yesterday responded and identified 2 recommendations that they wish the applicant to consider. One is a removal of a tree, and one is a permanently securing cable and telephone lines along the frontage. So we've accepted those recommendations, and I've actually built that into the draft approval resolution that you have before you tonight. You have both a draft negative seeker declaration and a draft access approval resolution for the board's consideration. As I understand it, the fire department memorandum has been provided to the applicant, and as I say, the access approval reso does address those issues, makes them a condition of approval. So they're for the board to consider tonight.
Any comments from board members? We'll entertain a motion to adopt a negative declaration.
I'll move to adopt the negative declaration.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you. The resolution. Any questions about that? Okay, move to adopt.
I'll make that motion.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me get rid of this. I didn't take this out of here, J. Mark. Okay, the next item, Alex Campbell, 4 Cliffside Court, 28 Upland Drive. Applicant is seeking approval of access to the property with the intent to construct a new single-family residence. Draft resolution has been prepared. Comments, Ron?
Yeah, again, the board has draft approval resos before you for consideration. The board's been discussing this project for some period. Similarly, this has made a referral to the Continental Village Fire Department, and they identified a variety of improvements they sought appropriate for both Upland Drive and Cliffside Court. Excuse me. The proposed driveway is along Cliffside Court. So the draft approval resolution of the site access identifies those as conditions of approval among your other standard conditions. So they're both for you to consider tonight.
Okay, we have draft resolution from Ron or Campbell. Any discussion from the board?
There was some question as to whether we received a signed EAF on this. Did we ever button that up, Ron?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it did come in, and it was distributed it this morning.
Right.
Did come through. I did send it to everyone.
Very good.
Okay. So that's all the information we needed from him?
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
One lacking information that we resolved last night, I transmitted this morning.
Okay, motion to adopt the resolution.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
The negative secret.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Isn't that what we're talking
Huh?
about?
No.
Secret resolution.
Yeah, we need a motion to adopt a negative seeker declaration. Anyone?
I'll make that motion.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
And now the resolution. Motion to adopt.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you. Let's get rid of this. Item number 3. Scoping session for Hudson Highland Reserve. I'd like to make a couple comments before we get started, because this could get lengthy. We try not to. We've asked anybody who plans to speak to sign in. There's a sheet in back, if you would, and it tells you name, address, and if you're affiliated with any organization. We're going to let you know that the meeting is being filmed. All comments will be on the record. Anyone who's spoken, we ask that you submit copies of your speech or your comments so that we'll have them in the record and the secretary will have them. We're going to ask the project sponsor to briefly describe the project and craft a scope. They're going to try and limit the time of speaking to between 3 and 5 minutes. There'll be no back and forth between speakers. Say your point and finish and provide us with a written comment. Speakers will be called in sign-in order, and identify yourself for the TV before you start speaking. And when we get done, we'll ask if there's anyone who hasn't been heard from. The meeting will be held open for 1 week to allow for review of the draft and additional comments that can be mailed in or emailed by the close of business next Thursday. And then comments received by June 28th will be compiled by the project sponsor and consultants. Simultaneously, the final scope will be prepared. And then we have some more information. The scope must be prepared within 60 days, but that's August 4th. And the applicant will prepare a DEIS. Intent is to collect input on the draft scope for the purpose of establishing an outline of what should be analyzed in the draft environmental impact statement. And comments should be limited to the draft scope of the DEIS. And I want to thank AKRF for providing a basic outline for us. Steve, if you have any comments to get us started?
Thanks, Andy. Everyone, I'm sure, has received the written draft scope, which we, approved for use at the last meeting. Now, the draft scope is basically, besides some preamble and introduction, basically going to be the table of contents for the draft environmental impact statement that's being prepared. Now, the draft scope that we're working off tonight is by no means an exhaustive or overly detailed table of contents. It sets forth, as you can plainly see if you start at page 3, that the DEIS is going to begin with a description of the project, including its location, its layout, the site areas, and there's sub-points to put some meat on the bone there as far as what's going to be in it. But it's going to be up to the applicant to decide, the detail and the information that they're going to provide to satisfy you that they've adequately described the project. And when they come in with their draft environmental impact statement, you're going to have a chance to accept it or to reject it as incomplete. You would reject it as incomplete if they hadn't touched upon all the areas, or if the information that they had provided was plainly inadequate to address the areas that you identified. It's not just that you may disagree with what they said. If they don't address it is what we'll be looking at. But we'll get into that when we get to the EIS. There's a section on construction and maintenance, and of course they identify the approvals. And after that, section 5 is on page 4. We're going to get to the meat, if you will, the main purpose of the EIS, which is looking at the identified potential significant adverse environmental impacts, discussing them, and discussing how they might be mitigated to the maximum extent practicable. And the first one identified is water resources, and as you can see, that's broken down into a statement of the existing conditions, groundwater, floodways, and wetlands. Talk about anticipated impacts on surface water and groundwater, floodways, and wetlands, and then it'll talk about mitigated measures. Now let's just stop there. At this scoping session, one of the main purposes is to, well, listen to people and of course to take any comments board members might have about, and we'll do the same thing for the other sections too. Let's start with this one though, about the impacts on water resources. If you see something in there that you think has already been adequately covered and there's just no reason to go over it again, then it's appropriate to say, gee, I really don't think there's any need to talk about, I don't know, and I'm going to pick something out of thin air. I'm not suggesting by any means you should do something like this, but stormwater management measures. We know what the stormwater management measures are. I don't want to hear about them anymore. Enough's enough. We know them forward and backward. You could say, I want to take that out. I'm not suggesting you should do that. I'm just saying it's the type of thing that any board would do when they, review a scope like this. By the same token, if there's something you want to have looked at about water, and I mean surface water and groundwater and floodways and wetlands pretty well covers it, but I mean, I don't know, maybe there's something in particular that you want to point out and say, I want that particular item, that particular aspect of water resources on the project analyzed and discussed. Now's the time to say it, because if you leave them the way that they are here, that may be covered, the thing you have in mind, or it may not be. But I mean, bring it up, and your consultants will talk over whether we need a separate subpart in the final scope to make sure that that's covered, or if it's already something that's going to be covered by virtue of what's in there. So that's how we're going to look at water resources, and you'll receive comments from the public too, and it'd be the exact same thing with them. People are going to come up and look. Some people may be more attuned to the scoping process and say, I think that under item A1, lowercase a, you should add a 0.3 saying that, and that's fine. If they're that attuned to it, that's a great thing for them to suggest, and it's really on point and makes it easier for the consultants. But they may also come in and say something like, I'm concerned about siltation of the pond, and that's fine too. When we look over the comments, your consultants, and I'm sure you can put it together yourselves as well, will say siltation of the pond was an issue that was raised at scoping session. Either that's something that's going to be covered under the existing scope under item A2, I guess it would be lowercase a, or it's not, and it's something that we should add, or maybe they'll say we should split A1 or 2A lowercase 2 into 2A and 2B, or make it into a 3, whatever it might be. And those comments, if there's something that's not already covered in here, are going to form the basis for the draft final scope, the proposed final scope that you're going to look at your next meeting. So the next item in covered is vegetation and wildlife, and it talks about existing conditions, and then it talks about anticipated impacts, and then it will look at mitigation measures. Now, vegetation and wildlife is a pretty broad topic. It could cover a lot of different things. I was discussing with Andy the other day, for example, the issue of, impacts on the scarlet tanager was mentioned. Now, it's important for you to understand that an EIS isn't an encyclopedia. It doesn't have to cover every conceivable impact. But if for some reason you thought, my gosh, impacts on the scarlet tanager's habitat are something we absolutely have to look at, this is a crucial area for it, then you might be the type of thing that you add to your scope. I'm not suggesting that by any means on this, by the way. I'm just using that as an example. It could just as easily be timber rattlers or leopard frogs or box turtle, whatever it might be. And you might group that under endangered species impacts on, by the way. You wouldn't necessarily break it down by. But that's the type of thing that you might want to add to that, or not, depending on how you feel about it. Next is zoning and land use. This covers existing conditions, anticipated impacts, community character, and that's about it. Now, I would anticipate that in this section, we're going to see discussion of the town's comprehensive plan and the extent to which the proposed development is consistent with that, or perhaps is not, depending on how you look at it. If you feel that that's something that you want, and your consultants will give you memos on this when we're done as far as that goes, but if it's something that's important to you and you want to see a separate section on that or a subsection on it, now's a good time to raise that. Then we get into alternatives. Now, alternatives are reasonable alternatives to the project that is proposed. You cannot ask the applicant in the scope or in the EIS to propose as alternatives a project completely different than the project that's being proposed. It's reasonable to say to the applicant, I would like to see your project with the houses reconfigured, or with a smaller equestrian center, or something along those lines. It's not reasonable to say to the applicant, I want to see what the impacts would be if this was just all farmland. There is a no-build contingency allowed for under the SEQA regulations, but that's basically just to give you a baseline of what the impacts are going to be as opposed to the impacts, what would happen on the property if no development occurred at all. So I don't think you're going to, every once in a while you do one of these and you have somebody come in and say, I'd like to see the alternatives if it was built as, I don't know, a Stop and Shop, or if it was built as, set of condominiums or something like that. And it's not what the applicant's proposing. That's not what SEQA means by alternatives. And then, there'll be conclusions at the end and adverse environmental impacts that cannot be avoided, if any. Irreversible and irretrievable account of resources. Once you take down the trees, they're taken down. Once you just level the land, it's leveled, that type of thing. Growth-inducing impacts, the extent to which this is going to have an impact on development in this area of the town, municipal services, things like that. Appendices will be copies of the reports and supporting documentation that the applicant will be submitting. All of the representations that they make in the EIS have to be supported by reference to some empirical evidence, expert opinion, letters from some municipal agency saying this is so or that is not so. And at the end of the day, we'll have an EIS that reviews all these items and hopefully supports the representations made in it. Does anybody have any questions about the relationship between the scope and the EIS, or how the scoping session tonight's going to work?
Personally, I thought that was pretty clear, but if we do, you stay with us. Do you have the sign-in sheet? Yeah, please. So we should begin soliciting comments?
Well, do you want to wait till 7:30 on that, or?
Oh, do a little jig or something?
I'm open to ideas. I think that's when the paper said it was.
Were we also going to let the applicant present first before comments? I thought that's what.
Yeah, but
Okay.
did get a little confused on the advertisement. Is actually, the advertisement's for 7:30. We got done with the early things pretty quickly, so everybody want to take a break until 7:30?
I think it's only appropriate if we advertise it for 7:30.
Yeah, we can't really start before the advertised time. Thank you. Has everybody signed this who wants to speak? Please, otherwise you won't be called. So, thank you. All right. Ron, do you have anything you want to add?
No.
Chris?
No, thanks, Steve.
Aaron?
That's great. Were there any questions, Steve mentioned, were there any questions with regard to the materials that we provided on sort of how this is going to be laid out tonight? Were there any questions from board members about the materials we provided with regard to how this is going to be set up, or sort of the process and timing moving forward after tonight? What will be expected and what you'll be doing between now and the next planning board meeting?
One of the things you said on your June 18th memo, that we'd have a week to accept additional written comments. And then next Thursday, the comment period, acceptance of comments will be closed. From that point to the next month's meeting, the July meeting, what is going on in the interim? Can you clarify that for everybody?
Sure, that's a good question. So you'll receive comments tonight from public. You can also provide, as Steve mentioned, you can also provide comments. That'll be first, right? Let all of us know and the applicant know what it is that you want to see in this document, the scope. Once the meeting tonight is ended, there'll be an additional week to receive written comments. 28th of next week, all of the comments will be gathered, and we'll go through, categorize them, organize them, put them in a table so that they can be identified by section in the current scope If there's any additional comments that don't fit into, as Stephen mentioned, if there's any comments that don't fit into any of the sections that are in here, we'll have additional sections noted. We'll share that information with the applicant. They'll have all these comments, obviously. And from there, the applicant will take that information and work on a revision of this scope to address comments and incorporate all of those items that were raised by the public, by the planning board, and by any involved agencies that may have comment. The scope itself was published in the environmental notice bulletin and was distributed by Tara to the agencies identified that would have some discretionary authority over some portion of this project. Those are the interest or involved agencies. They have the opportunity to provide written comment as well. So if there anything comes in from them, that will be compiled with all the other comments. From there, that draft scope will be reviewed internally, and we'll get you a copy prior to the next meeting. And at that next meeting, the board will vote as to whether or not that revised scope is sufficient for setting forth the outline for the draft environmental impact statement, which will then be developed by the applicant.
Now, the DEIS, as a result of what you just said, discrepancies, say, between what the scope and the DEIS says and what the applicant feels is legitimate. Is it? I'm not quite sure where the chasm is laid here. I mean, what do you go from what information that the members have? I mean, there was some significant comments back in April, and that's why I want to introduce comments from the board as board comments and written statements. Where is it? They've produced a plan, and we've been working on this for 4 years. But now we get down and we say, based on the information we have and the public and so forth, we have this DEIS. There's just maybe discrepancies what the DEIS produces and what the applicant wants. I'm not quite sure where to direct this question, but if there's differences of what the applicant wants to do and what the board wants to do before approval. I mean, approval's down the road somewhere, but there's got to be differences of what we think we want, the planning board, the town wants, and what the applicant wants. Obviously, I'm not getting through it.
No. Quickly on that. So this scope will be the outline for the DEIS. The next step will be to prepare the DEIS. The applicant will prepare that, submit it. The planning board will review that to ensure that it is consistent with what's in the scope. Okay. It's not an assessment of whether or not you agree with what's been presented or not. It is a check to make sure that it is compliant with all of the sections of the scope that were set forth by the planning board for the applicant to follow. At that time, the DEIS itself, once you review it and becomes accepted as a complete document, once it's compliant with this, then you go to the next step where you have sort of a substantive review to make sure that everything that's been presented in that DEIS is accurate. You have the opportunity to go back and say, well, this seems to be, for example, the calculations for your stormwater runoff in this area seem to be not based on the TR55 manual or whatever it might be. And then you can ask the applicant to go and revise those things in the final environmental impact statement. The purpose of the alternatives in this document is to have, the focus of this document will be an assessment of the proposed plan.
Right.
So that the applicant has a proposed plan, that's their preferred plan. The analysis done in this will be on that plan. The alternatives that are at the end allow the planning board the opportunity to see how those alternatives identified compare with the proposed preferred plan that the applicant's going to review. So they'll go through this painstakingly for the preferred action. And after that, in the alternative section, they'll go through and compare how each of the alternatives sort of measures up with the preferred alternative, or their preferred action,
Right.
okay? And at that point, the planning board can then take a look at what those differences are and you know, think about what they might want to see further in the next step of the environmental review. You get to a point where the project, and you can make this determination as to however you want, but the project itself then goes through the final environmental impact statement. You get to, that gets through the review process by the planning board and the consultants. And then findings are made, and at the time of findings, the planning board can determine whether or not they are okay with the way this project has been set forth and reviewed or not.
Okay, thanks.
Does that answer your question, Steve? Do you have
Yeah.
anything else?
The only other thing, that was a good answer, Chris. The only other thing I was going to say, Andy, is it's important to keep in mind that getting to the point, this secret process is going to terminate in what's called a finding statement.
Right.
And the finding statement is going to either make a determination that the adverse environmental impacts have been mitigated to the maximum extent practicable or hasn't, and it may, you know, if it determines that they have not been, impose conditions on development which would result in suitable mitigation, or it could be that you find that they're just not mitigated at all and you find that it requires denial. I mean, that's a possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen by any stretch, but just, you know, if you looked at the options tree, that's certainly an option. But the point is this: the finding statement will not require grant of conservation subdivision approval. That's dependent upon the criteria set forth in the town code. Now, the findings that you make in SEQRA, assuming that you find that the adverse environmental impacts have been mitigated to the maximum extent practicable, are certainly going to inform your decision as to whether or not they've met the criteria in the town code, but they aren't necessarily determinative of it. So if you know, at the end of the SEQRA process say that's great and they've you know, done a good job as far as the design of this, but thing of it is they don't meet, and you're going to have something very specific.
Yeah.
Don't meet this, that, or the other thing, then you know, it isn't necessarily going to result in grant of the approval.
Okay, I'm wondering if we should start now with soliciting comments. We're not there yet. Oh, we got a minute. We got a minute.
You can do a countdown like in New Year's, or
Nah, more like
All the
the,
people who are going to speak first here.
more like the
well,
Derby.
you could have them if they walk slowly. They could probably get up for 7:30. You want to start with the presentation, though, or?
Yeah, why don't we? Glenn?
Good evening. My name is Richard O'Rourke. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Keenan Bean PC. I have been representing the client on this application about halfway through the process. About 2 years ago, I became engaged. Everything that was said by your attorney and planning consultant, I agree with. I think they gave you a lucid explanation of what the process is, and there are steps and procedures that must be followed so as to make sure that you are in compliance with the law. But I think the overriding situation or environment, to use a word, as defined by the regulations, by the law, as adopted, and by the courts, is that what's to be applied to this process is a rule of reason. And what that means is that there has to be a balancing of environmental issues with economics and property rights consideration. This is a piece of property that has been owned by a resident here for he's been a resident here for over 10 years. And so the framework in which we're looking at this is to develop his property in conformity with and within his capabilities and objectives of what he wants to accomplish. And so I think that that's an important consideration, and that's the context in which all of this is evaluated. Other than that, everything that was said in terms of I agree with, and we have no debate about that. What I think would be most helpful, and I know that there are some people here that perhaps have not been here before, and it's typical that we have an opportunity to give a brief presentation of what the program is, what the proposed action is, and obviously that is what we would like to do next, and we will get to that right away. We have with us our consultant, Suzanne, who is here, McDonald, and we have a presentation that is brief and concise, which is in keeping with what secret's supposed to be. But what we would first like to do is have Glenn just introduce the plan. So, Glenn?
Oh, we're going to have to move, is that?
Just go around the other side of the table.
Let me get this thing off. Oh, I got it.
Probably do this on.
Good evening. My name is Glennon Watson. I'm with Beatty and Watson Surveying and Engineering. And we represent the applicant as his engineers, surveyors, and planners. Tonight we're talking about the Hudson Highlands Reserve. It's a 210-acre accumulation of about 5 different parcels. The property is located in the northerly part of town. To the northwest of this picture is oriented north up the sheet. Property has frontage on Route 9. It has frontage on Horton Road. It has frontage on East Mountain Road South, and it has frontage on East Mountain Road North. The plan is to develop a conservation subdivision of 25 lots, plus an equestrian center for 40 horses. Within the property, there's an existing pond, Omar Pond. To the southeast, there's some steep slope land. To the south portion of property approaching the pond, there's some wetlands. Clove Creek runs along this. I've got that right. Yes, Clove Creek runs along the side of the property, and a very small amount of Clove Creek, a small portion of Clove Creek, I should say, runs through the property and exits the property, goes under Route 9 and flows to the north. Although I mentioned that the project has frontage on 4 different roads, the sole access that we are taking on a regular basis is from Route 9. The road system that is being planned is going to come in from Route 9, just north of the crossover of Clove Creek, next to the PEMCORP, what used to be the PEMCORP building, that people have been around a while. PEMCORP building, J. Mark Jeweler is up a little bit further to the north. The road will come in, circle up, come up the hill, and come into the main part of the property. Somebody, Jonathan, can you? Oh, went away, sorry, whatever. Oh, you know what, I guess I touched the thing and did that. I apologize. And I didn't touch it that time. The road will come up through the property, and ultimately it will end at the equestrian center off of this main road. I apologize. Off of this main road, there will be a cul-de-sac with some houses on it. There will be houses off on the road. I don't know what's going on. It must be my hand that's doing it. I'll try to do it with a shadow. The cul-de-sac is going off to the southwest, cul-de-sac going off to the northeast. Some of the features in the project are a large buffer around the pond to protect the pond. Of course, the equestrian center, 25 houses in 3 different areas, one in between the cul-de-sac and the main road, one to the northeast of the equestrian center, and one to the west of the pond. The acres, the lots consist about 1 acre each. There are a couple of few that are slightly under an acre, but generally they're an acre. We anticipate the permanent conservation of about 153 acres. The property has some commercial zoning. It has commercial zoning up on Route 9. It's in the rural residential district, and it's in a couple of overlay zones. Primarily, the largest part of it's in the the largest part of it is also in the large lot overlay zone. We're trying to conserve the most significant environmentally significant portions of the property: steep slopes down to Clove Creek, steep slopes up to East Mountain Road North, and project will be serviced by a common septic system, a common sewage collection system, a common septic system, individual wells. It will be controlled by a homeowners association, and in addition to the conservation easement, with some strict covenants and restrictions that will govern the property and allow for the payment, the internal payment of the cost of maintaining the subdivision and the conservation subdivision in a way a subdivision really should be maintained. Membership of the homeowners association will be mandatory, and I think I've given just an overview of it, and I think that's about what I need to say.
Suzanne McGovern is one of our consultants, our equine consultants, along with Reinhard Teeter. She's going to take us through very quickly the elements in that regard. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Glenn. Hello. Hello. Ooh. Hello. Is that better? Okay. So as Glenn mentioned, what I am going to do is give you what is hopefully a snappy summation of what the Hudson Highlands Reserve is. I got 5 minutes, so wish me luck. We may as well get started. Yeah, go ahead and hit that. Okay. So we might ask, what or who is Hudson Highlands Reserve? So you can click that. What I can tell you is that really what it boils down to, where Hudson Highlands Reserve started, is with Uli Lisiaga, and he is right here. Some of you may know him, but basically Uli is an architect by profession. He is particularly interested in sustainable and contemporary design. He is a husband and father. There he's taking that awesome selfie on the left with his lovely wife Christina and a few kids. He has been a Cold Spring neighbor for 14 years, and that's his daughter Lizzie. He's a horse lover and nature lover. That's his daughter Lizzie, showing in a little horse show competition. So when we think about, for those of you who know Yulee, it seems obvious. For those who don't, it's sort of, well, what was he thinking when he came up with this Hudson Highland Reserve? So if you go to the next slide. Basically, Yulee's vision was to marry professional and personal passions, which are the natural environment, sustainable living, and horses, to build a new gold standard of ecocentric, equine-centric community living that can serve as a beacon for all conservation communities. And that translates into a more pragmatic, well, what are you going to do with that vision, mission of developing a conservation subdivision community of weekend or vacation homes with an equestrian facility for like-minded nature lovers, with the objective to provide a full and authentic living experience that is also sustainable with conservation in mind and is a first for Philipstown. So what are the key components? Glenn just spoke to this a little bit, but to summarize, it's 210 acres, 73% of which is conservation land. As you know, conservation land is a focal point, so is a modern, eco-conscious 40-horse equestrian facility, which will be relevant and accessible to both Hudson Highland residents and the larger community of Philipstown. There'll be 25 sustainable single-family homes. I'm going to talk about them a little bit more in a minute. Of course, Ulmart Pond, well-loved and well-known, and a historic barn already on the property that will be restored as a community clubhouse. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with sustainable building, I'll just clarify that sustainable, or green, as some may call it, is building with a structure and process that optimizes efficiency of resources while minimizing impact on the environment and human health. And in layman, in English for the rest of us, what that means is it's optimizing the site, efficiency of energy, water, and materials, optimizing indoor environment quality, and all of this not just for the process of building, but for maintenance ongoing. Okay, so when we think about these sustainable homes or these custom-built homes for Hudson Highlands Reserve specifically, beyond that definition, we're talking about 2,500 square foot homes on 1 acre lots that are individually designed. These are not cookie cutters, and they're in a forested environment. They are Hudson Valley appropriate character with modern amenities. They will meet the rural residential zoning and LEED certification for guidelines. And for those of you who don't know, LEED certification is sort of the gold standard of qualification in sustainable living, or one of them. There's going to be an aim for zero net energy use. And when I speak to individually designed and we think about sustainable building, they're going to maximize, each lot will maximize the location, orientation, landscaping, and daylighting for that particular lot of land that will be built into the home. As we mentioned, equestrian facility, this is a centerpiece of the community. It's going to be the centerpiece of the facility is a 60,000 square foot equestrian center. A little less than half of that is actually going to be just a big, airy, spacious indoor arena. The other half is going to be the stable facilities where the horses live. And within that, there are going to be 40 12-foot by 12-foot box stalls where these horses will live. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with horses, that's pretty healthy, happy, comfortable, spacious living for horses. There's going to be 40,000 square foot of paddock space that will be divided into smaller paddocks that will enable those horses to have regular and healthy turnout. And there will be a very large 45,000 square foot outdoor arena that, like its indoor counterpart, will be spacious and airy and clean. Now, when we think about, how do you take a facility like this and make sure it works and it's healthy and pleasant, there's going to be a state-of-the-art manure storage and removal system, and we're not kidding or exaggerating to say that it's state-of-the-art. In addition to the stalls, the arena and paddocks will have a foundation and footing that's designed to prevent leaching specifically. And the Hudson Highlands Reserve total daily water consumption for this property will be 15%, less than 15% of the aquifer recharge rate. That is, it will be, I'm not a mathematician, but the recharge rate will be 6 times what is required for the water that's going to be consumed on a daily basis for an average annual. And finally, it just says that natural light and clean open space are central design themes of the entire facility and the entire community, really. So what I'm going to do is hand it over. Oop, you're going
Yes,
to do
if
it?
I may, thank you.
Okay.
I just quickly want to make an observation, and we typically have a court stenographer for this. The court stenographer on her way here hit a bear, and so she is delayed. However, we have someone that we were able to pull up here, and she's here, and I'd like to get her set up if I could, particularly to take the comments. Obviously, that was an act of God beyond our control. So, but we recognize that typically for a scoping session, you have you have a stenographer, but obviously nature interfered with that. Lastly and finally, we're just wrapping up in terms of the equestrian facility. Reinhard Teeter has decades of experience, is going to just explain that, and then we're done. So, Reinhard. Do you want to set up front?
Good evening. My name's Reinhard Teeter. I have been in and around the horse business since I was a teenager, in everything as a rider, a trainer, a buyer and seller of facilities, and a developer of several facilities. I'm here specifically to speak about the primary environmental concern of any horse facility, which is waste management. And there are really 5 very important components to that. How the building is designed, how stall design and maintenance are managed, waste storage and removal, riding arena design and maintenance, and paddock design and maintenance. This illustration is basically the base that will be under any aspect of the facility, be it a riding arena, a stall, or a paddock area, to prevent the biggest problem, environmental problem, which is leaching. If you'll see it, you can see it and you can read it. It's basically a stone base, aggregate stone, covered with geotextile fabric, and then a stone dust hardened base, and then whatever specific surface is needed for that given area. To give you an understanding, the stalls that the horses will live in will be 100% or 99.9% leach proof, because the surface there will be custom fitted rubber mats so that nothing can get past them. In the outdoor rings, because they're weather dependent, the bases will be, or the subsoil will be crowned, and the entire perimeter of the outdoor rings and the paddock areas will be curtain drained to capture anything and everything that's leakage based. And the 60,000 square foot building, the indoor ring, will be built exactly the same way, preventing any possibility of leakage. On top of that, why don't you, Yuli, go to the next. On top of that, there'll be a maintenance program, which in any quality facility does, where stalls are cleaned on a daily basis, usually picked in the afternoon again, and the manure is then moved to a storage area of this design with a container, a retaining wall. The base that the container is sitting on is a tilted platform that has a drain to carry anything that might fall out of the container into an 800-gallon septic system. You'll see that it's set up with a retaining wall so that the dumping into the container minimizes any spillage, and any of the walkways from the stall building or the equestrian facility that staff will be moving horse waste with in wheelbarrows or carts will be covered with asphalt and swept on a daily basis so that the possibility of leakage is next to nothing. The combination of design, as I just explained, and daily maintenance basically eliminates the possibility of leakage. And leakage in the ground or groundwater is really the primary concern. This isn't the old-fashioned type of stable. The majority of stables, and you still see them, are basically pole barn buildings, no foundations, and the stalls are just put on dirt. In many cases, the outdoor rings and the paddocks are just on dirt or on grass, and they're not managed on a regular basis. most modern facilities, and the most recent facility I was involved in was 15 years ago, we did this almost identically, and had a very strong maintenance program in the sense of stall cleaning, which was daily, picking of paddocks, daily grooming of the indoor arenas after the indoor arenas and outdoor arenas were picked, and the same with the paddocks, and had no issues whatsoever. And the last place I was involved in that we built was outside of Litchfield, Connecticut, and there were a lot of water issues there. So proof of the pudding is the eating. All of this work was a product of research I did then and have revisited again, and basically these designs and the discussion that I've just pointed out to you is a product of Penn State, University of Illinois, University of Minnesota, and a few other institutions. The reason we're doing this is simply because I don't believe it was made absolutely clear how this would be handled. The bottom line is a properly designed facility and managed facility, even on 7 or 8 acres as this, could actually, with 100 horses, do less damage than 10 horses without any facility design. And we've seen that in other places where there's been environmental damage because they were built on pole barns and there wasn't good management and so forth and so on. So it's not so much an issue of the size of the facility in the sense of horse population as it is design and management. And that's all I got to say. Thanks. You bet.
Because they won't be able to work unless we turn it off.
Thanks, daughter.
Yes, I just wanted to say our court stenographer, the one who did not hit a bear tonight, is now here. So all I would respectfully request, if someone makes a statement, he or she just state the name clearly, where they're from, and then make the statement. And then, of course, this way, for accuracy purposes, the court stenographer will have that information. Thank you.
That's one of the primary requirements. Also, I require our secretary asks that you provide a copy of the presentations. Yes, we will. Okay, thank you. I guess we start our comments. Steve? First thing I'd like to do is survey the board, and I would like to enter into the record the comments of each of the board members. All 7 were here at the April 18th meeting, but Mr. Zuckerman and Ms. Connor are not here tonight. But I go around the table and ask if the board members have anything they want to say tonight. And then once they do, I want to enter the comments from that minutes of April 18th into the record. So, David?
You know, I have a question. I don't know if this is appropriate. And
Just give your name first.
David Hardy. And I have a question for the gentleman who just was telling us about the equestrian center. And I understand the leakage problem, and that looks like it's perfectly well addressed. And my question is, because I don't know much about horses, okay, anything, but there are going to be 40 horses. Do they not need to exercise every day?
Excuse me, I just want to, we're not going to do a back and forth. Just ask your question, and we'll have to.
I'll answer as quickly as I can.
Okay, would you please?
Okay, well, let me rephrase it in a more compact way. If it's the case that the horses have to go out, and they're 40 horses, and they have to go for a minimum amount of time, how is that going to be handled? I mean, what kind of staff does it need to make that happen on a...
The anticipated staff, per se, for the facility at full operation, which would be 40 horses, would be 12 people, management and staff. Yes, you're right, horses need to move. The type of horses that would be involved at this facility, which would be either competition horses or pleasure horses, recreational horses, the point of the horse or an owner bringing a horse to that facility is that they can use the facility. These types of horses, between a program developed by the teacher/trainer, whoever they're working with, and the owner who's riding, or the owner's rider, whoever that might be, they essentially develop a program where the horses work anywhere from 4 to 6 days a week. They usually get 1 day a week, which is usually, in industry standard, is on Mondays.
We're getting a little bit more than we need now, I think. Dave?
Sure, it would be great to see.
And the paddocks, 10 to 12 paddocks, when horses are in work, they don't need to be out all day long. They need to be out for an hour to an hour and a half. So when you think about 10, 12 paddocks, not all horses get turned out every day. You're talking about those paddocks being used maybe 3.5 hours a day per paddock with horses out.
Could I direct the board members, rather than getting into a back and forth, just state your concerns and we get that on the record, rather than just soliciting an exchange? I'm not criticizing Dave. I just,
No,
we
no,
need,
no, it's okay.
none of us have done this before. We need a plan of
I
action.
understand.
Peter?
Oh. I thought that by and large, the draft scope was pretty comprehensive. I take also into effect the Hudson Highlands Land Trust letter, which I thought did a really good job of not poking holes so much as making it a deeper document. But I guess I fell back time and again to the fact that all of this is going to be documented with zoning compliance, so that made me feel good. And by and large, the brushstrokes work for me.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Neil? Dennis?
Same comment that I had initially was how the size of the equestrian center was established and how the number of horses came into play. And there was a comment just now which I would want to have addressed regarding inclusion of pleasure horses in the facility. So,
Yeah, going back to the minutes from April, it's, okay, you're just reiterating the question you had at the time. I had a number of issues. Let's see. One is about the size of the stable, the size of the equestrian center, and the waste, not just the solid waste, but liquid waste and leaching into the ground, and also questioning the size of the lots and houses on them and the proximity to the ponds. And these are issues I think need to be addressed. But it's all these statements that we made are back in the April 18th minutes under item B, old business Hudson Highlands Reserve. So I want to enter that into the record as our written comments. Now, I think we'll start soliciting comments from the audience. First person on the list is Richard Nan, 36 Horton Road. Come forward to the microphone and state your name.
Hi, my name's Richard Nairn. I live on Horton Road. And I'm here tonight for two main reasons. First, I think that this board really needs to look at the magnitude and scope of this project. And the reason I say that, and I think it's the reasoning of a lot of people, is the geography. And you know, it's not like we're across the river with all this flat land that could support a project of this magnitude. We got a lot of steep slopes that are on the backside of this project. Mountain runoff water, 4 to 5 inches of rain. You'd be surprised how much rain comes off of that mountain. Hurricane Irene totally blew out the backside of Horton Road. The whole thing was gone. It's all sitting in Ulmer Pond. They had to totally reconstruct backside of Horton Road. So we get 4 to 5 inches or more of rain. It's an issue. It is a big issue. And Ulmer Pond especially is such a fragile, fragile zone. Any housing around that, as we all know, the pond sets down low. The surrounding property around it sets up high. It's a recipe for disaster. These are common sense issues here. Common sense. It's going to happen. You have a little outlet pipe from Ulmer Pond on the outlet. It goes back down underneath Horton Road. It's going to happen again. It's all going to get blown out. The pipes are going to blow out. Horton Road's going to be, it's going to happen. I mean, this is common sense. So again, I think the magnitude of the project in general just needs to really be looked at. You know, I think the project should certainly happen, but the magnitude, this has to be looked at. This is very important. Clove Creek is fragile, which is also protected by New York State, supposed to be. But again, that Ulmer Pond, that whole area right there is extremely fragile. We've seen it time and time again when we get rain. Other than that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, Betsy Calhoun. Just remind you to, we ask you to limit it to 3 to 5 minutes, please.
Oh, okay. I'll try. Just yesterday, I drove up Horton Road. I'd never been there before. Today, I drove up Mill Road. I'd never been there before. It's amazing. I mean, this isn't the woods. I live in the woods. I know what that's like. It's nothing like this property. This property, I assume all of you have been there, but I was really struck, stunned. I know this isn't exactly on the point. It's something so special that you can't get back, and other towns don't have something like this. And when I looked at the plans, it will destroy the area, totally destroy it. 25 houses, each with an acre, and their lawn, their swimming pool. Everybody has his own swimming pool. These people only come up on the weekends. Where do the staff live? Do they live in any of the 25 houses? I doubt it. So there's this group of very separate elitist people who only come up sometimes. I'm addressing the community effects. What do they give to our community? Barely some money. But to put this in place of a primeval forest, where I know someone saw prints of a mountain lion, in addition to all the endangered species that are listed. That's very special. I just think the owners should get the benefit of a conservation easement for there shall be no building. Agree to not do anything, and they should have a conservation easement, and that's appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Michelle Smith.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to present comments on the draft scope.
Michelle, just for the record, the organization you're in.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Michelle Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust. We did submit comments earlier this week by email. I did bring a few more copies in case anybody hadn't seen them. And what I first wanted to do was just give a little bit of context for our comments, because I know Peter referred to them earlier, and I know they're quite detailed, Part of the reason for that is that we do believe this project is very special in Philipstown. Oh, thank you. It is the first conservation subdivision under the Philipstown zoning code. It also lies in 3 overlay districts of Philipstown as defined in the zoning code: the open space overlay, the scenic protection overlay, and the Clove Creek aquifer overlay. In addition to that, it's quite visible from key points in both Fawnstock State Park and Hudson Highlands State Park. Now, having said that, and as the applicant has mentioned many times, a large part of the property is in close proximity to Route 9, so that's already a disturbed area. And we agree that this is a good site for a conservation subdivision. In a conservation subdivision, what you're really trying to do is really minimise the environmental impact, to minimise the ecological footprint so that it's not much greater than the actual development footprint. And therefore, we think it's really, really important that the EIS that gets produced from this process is very comprehensive in terms of addressing all those environmental impacts and how to minimise them to the smallest extent possible, especially given that this is a conservation subdivision. So what we did in our comments, in our written comments, which I'll just summarise here, is we address 5 areas in sections 4 and 5 of the draft scope. And what we're really trying to do is make sure that the draft scope becomes a really good roadmap for a very comprehensive EIS for the reasons that I outlined before. And then what we also did is in section 6 alternatives, we recommended another alternative, alternative F, which we think has a lot of benefits because it would eliminate a lot of the impacts, significant environmental impacts, as well as it is much more likely that an established conservation organisation would take the easement on the conservation easement on the property. So just quickly, I'm going to address the 5 areas in sections 4 and 5 that we think need a lot more detail in the scope so that they get addressed in the EIS. So the first is the definition of open space that will have the conservation easement on it. There should be a call for a very detailed map so you can see exactly what the boundaries are of the conserved area and a description of how the conserved area will be marked. Will it be marked with fences? Will it be marked with stone walls? Will it be boundary posted? What exact activities will take place in the conserved area that's subject to a conservation easement? Also, what improvements, if any, will be made in the area that's subject to the conservation easement, and where will they be on a map? The second area of our comments has to do with land use plans, consistency with land use plans and with the zoning code. And on land use plans, as already been mentioned earlier tonight, there should be specific mention of the Philipstown Comprehensive Plan, as well as the Open Space and Natural Resource Plan of Philipstown, and in those, the rationale for conservation subdivisions for Philipstown. In the zoning code reference, we think there should be specific reference to the conservation subdivision provisions of the zoning code, particularly the issue of how the open space is defined and what that implies for fragmentation of the open space, and particularly what that implies for the ability of the easement holder to monitor and enforce the conservation easement. Then we also think there should be reference to another important area of the code, which is the amount of land for large livestock units, which the code calls for 40,000 square feet for each large livestock unit, of which a horse is one of them. And so there should be some addressing of consistency with the large livestock unit area of the code. The third is community character and scenic resources. We think there should be a full scenic analysis from key points in Fawnstock State Park and Hudson Highlands State Park, especially along Fishkill Ridge and Schofield Ridge. And then the next area of comments is wildlife. We've listed some local resources, local inventories of wildlife, many of which the applicant used in the conservation analysis. And we think there needs to be particular attention to the impact that the houses around the pond have on wildlife movement and their access to the pond and to water in general. And also, of course, the impact that the 40 horses will have on wildlife in the area. The fifth and final area is water resources, and we think that there needs to be, we've also given some recommendations of local data and information, and we think there needs to be analysis of the houses around the pond and the equestrian facility on the water resources and the aquatic life in the pond and Clove Creek. And then finally, our last recommendation was in section 6, alternatives, which we recommend an alternative F, which is a combination of the current alternative D and E. And what that alternative F would do is it would take the houses away from the pond. They'd still have the 25 lots, but they'd move them north of the pond and reduce the equestrian facility to a number of horses that's consistent with the exercising in the 40,000 square foot per horse that's in the equestrian facility. So reduce the number of horses to be compliant with that. And we think that alternative F would have many advantages. It would eliminate many environmental impacts and really get that ecological footprint down. But the other added bonus is you're much more likely to get an established conservation organisation to be willing to hold the conservation easement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Next speaker is Richard Butensky. I'm going to remind you, folks, again, please just try to be as brief as possible.
I'm going to be very brief. Richard Butensky, 407 East Mountain Road South, Cold Spring. I'm going to be very brief. I just feel that as far as the presentation that went on for the horse facility and the drainage, I have no expertise in that area, so I can't, but I would just say that one of the aspects of that was maintenance. I don't know how that is legislated to have somebody keep up maintenance if the facility changes hands. I don't know how that's administered. So I would urge that whatever number you end up on horses or no, whatever it is, that somehow that's stipulated and that there's some teeth behind maintaining those types of things. Otherwise, yeah, the amount per horse in the code is 40,000 square feet as opposed to 40,000 for the entire facility. So instead of 40,000 per horse, so that seems like a big disparity. And maybe again, while it might, I don't think it necessarily works for these type of horses, but if it does, it certainly may not work for a different type of horse that might take up that facility in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Lisiega. State your name. We know you. State your name for the record.
Ulysses Liceaga, and I'm speaking not as an applicant, but as a neighbor. And I just wanted to thank you again. But my comment is that for the last 4.5 years, we've been with the board answering to the questions, to the public questions, and we have done everything by the book of the law. We have, again, now we added 2 more consultants, and all those are fair questions, and we are happy to answer them, and we welcome them, and we thank you for helping the design process along. What I think that as a owner and as a neighbor, as a tax-paying neighbor of Cold Spring, I mean, my family and I have been paying school taxes for the last 14 years. And someone asked, well, what are you going to give to the community? And someone said that I might be an elitist. Well, that's not the case. I love this area, and I want my kids to have their place here because they love it, and they've been growing up, and this is their idea of fun.
I'd say the same if it was anybody else in the audience, but we just ask that you direct your comments to the scope, and if you'd like to see something else in the scope or something out of the scope, this really isn't a public hearing on the project. I'm not picking on you. I'd say the same if it was anybody else.
Well, okay, I respect that. It just looked to me like everybody was talking about whatever they wanted. But again, I believe that the scope of this project has been misinterpreted by maybe personal interests. So I have said before that most of the comment that we've gotten, very vocal minority, is like the neighbors around the area who have been using this property for recreational personal purposes. That's it.
Thank you. Last person on the list is John Clark. Is that right?
Hi, I'm John Clark. I'm 91 Horton Road. I sort of have a dog in this fight because I'm right by the development. So I only have 3 things I want to discuss. One, I think Rick has talked about, and others too, is the buffer around the pond. Particularly to the west of the pond, it's very narrow, and I just can't imagine there not being some kind of outflow from the houses and the road into the pond itself. I think, as Michelle said, a lot of issues would be addressed if everything were just moved off the pond. And with respect to the equestrian center, which I actually welcome, my daughter rides, it's funny because it actually, in a way, I guess, doesn't seem like it's big enough to accommodate 40 horses. I mean, I did a little back of the envelope math with respect to waste, and 40 horses would generate 360 tons of waste a year. 360 tons. Okay, and it's relatively near that pond. And now I understand this gentleman has done a lot of work in mitigating seepage and all of that, but still, that's a lot of stuff. And the third thing I want to say is I've sort of conceived of this, or how this development has been designed, as a form of gerrymandering, wherein gerrymandering is not necessarily against the law, but it's against the spirit of the law. And I feel like they've just carved out these plots, and technically there is conservation value in that, but realistically, as Michelle pointed out, particularly with respect to the pond, how are these animals going to get through there? I mean, I live right near the pond. I hear coyotes at night, and they're going down there to drink. Are they going to do that with all those houses there? I mean, I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Now, we don't have any more names on the list, but is there anyone here who hasn't spoken and would like to speak? Well, I'm going to close this and then...
I have a motion to close the scoping session, excepting for the 7-day comment period. Okay. And then we'll move forward from there. Second, I'll vote on it, obviously.
Entertain a motion to that effect, to close the scoping session, leave it open for 1 week for written commentary.
So moved.
Second?
I'll second that.
All in favor? Aye. Okay. Chris, anything you want to say? Okay, thank you. Now, we do have a meeting to close. Is there anything else anybody wants to say on the board? Ron, Steve?
No, the only thing I'd say, Andy, is on this, what'll happen next is we'll sit down with AKRF and with Ron, and AKRF's going to prepare the memo cross-referencing the comments to the draft scope, and we'll circulate a proposed draft scope, and we'll indicate if there's any dissent as to what might be in it before the next meeting. At the next meeting, you'll have the proposed final scope in front of you. If you don't like what's in the final scope, you should say that at the next meeting and say, I want to add this or take that out. But it would be, we'll get them to you as quick as we can. It would be good if you have those ideas in mind for the next meeting, because the 60 days expires August 4th. So we're not really going to have another meeting. We could have a special meeting if we had to, but I mean, you really don't want to do that. So it'd be nice if we could finalize everything at the next meeting, and we'll get it to you as quick as we can, read it over, and we'll go
July
from there.
19th.
I have a question, Steve. If we have comments or concerns between now and the next meeting, can we forward them to you so they can be included, or do we have to wait for the meeting? How?
Within the next 7 days, you can forward them to Tara, and they'll get, but it really wouldn't be appropriate after that
Okay.
to.
Same
At the
guidelines
meeting, you
as
can
the-
raise whatever you want. It would just be nice if
Yeah.
we had everything ready to
Yeah,
go.
okay.
And I would advise anyone who's still here who spoke, if you would direct your comments, written comments if possible, to our clerk, secretary, by the 8th.
28th.
I mean 28th, 8 days from now, the 28th. Thank you, keep me honest. Motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much.